Welcome back into Slick Talk. This is your host, Blackstone Joe, and today I'm not riding solo. I have my friend Ben with me.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me back on.
You know, today's a great day, not just because it's podcast recording day. The sun's out. It's 50 degrees, and I feel like I'm in Palm Beach. I don't know about you, but I'm enjoying it.
I have been outside multiple times without a jacket on, and it feels amazing.
You know, Midwesterners, we have thick skin, and we need to because the weather can turn at the drop of a hat. And I'm just glad that I'm able to drive around with the windows down and just enjoy myself. And today we have a topic that I think a lot of our listeners are going to enjoy too, because I think this comes up just quite a bit. This idea of additives and should we use them, should we not? But it came to the forefront because someone sent us an email and they were asking about, you know, when we say additives don't really show up, you know, for the uninitiated, I guess maybe we'll digress a bit here, Ben. What do we mean when we talk about additives? Let's just very broad stroke. What do we mean when we talk about an additive, and then we'll kind of get into whether or not it shows up and all that good stuff.
Well, an additive, I would define an additive as anything you add to your engine aside from what is required to make it run. You know, anything you add to the oil other than just the oil itself.
Yeah, so we aren't discussing what comes with the oil itself, which is an important distinction because oil has additives, and then, you know, but we're talking about products aside from that.
Yeah, in addition to.
I will say there with everything, there's exceptions to the rule. I'll bring up this one crazy example. Someone did send in a sample from their engine, and it was entirely Marvel Mystery Oil. They didn't run any oil. They filled up the sump entirely with Marvel Mystery Oil and ran their engine.
That sounds like an expensive experiment.
I would think so. Thankfully they didn't run it long, but I think this person had that stuff in there for like a few miles, you know?
Oh, wow. Do you remember what the viscosity read on that?
I don't, but I do know that thankfully the sample, it looked fairly quiet, and I think that's just because it wasn't in there very long.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, other than that, usually we're talking about instances where folks have their oil, they have their fuel, and then they're putting something else in there. So importantly, Ben, the question was, you know, what do we mean by the additives usually don't show up? Because usually, I don't know, I'd say I'm pretty comfortable saying 9 times out of 10 when someone mentions using an additive, it doesn't really skew the results. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, 9 times out of 10 sounds about right. There are a few additives that we definitely want to know about because they will affect how the sample looks in testing, but most of them, I would say, don't show up.
And when we talk about showing up, so here's what I want to break down for folks, because showing up is different than, you know, what are the miracle benefits. We're not talking about benefits. We're talking about how it registers in a sample when we actually get the sample in the lab. So there's a couple different arenas, I guess I would say, where it can show up. And the first is when we run a spectral analysis on the sample. We might find some interesting elements. So I'll just touch on a couple popular ones that will likely ring a bell for a lot of our listeners. Revex, Arch Oil. These are some of the additives we see most often. And there are also a couple that do show up. Elements, potassium, boron, pinch of sodium. You'll see these levels jump when you use something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I don't know about you, but I've been seeing Turbomax a little more often these days.
Yeah, it's not as common as say Arch Oil or Lucas or something like that, but I have been seeing a few more samples lately where people are running Turbomax.
I think one difference here is that typically I've been seeing it in gasoline engines, whereas RevX Arch Oil is so popular with the diesel crowd.
Yeah.
So similar to RevX and Arch Oil, it can inflate those elements we talked about, potassium, boron, harmlessly so. But yeah, so like I said, 9 times out of 10, I would say, in reference to additives, not just samples total, but 9 times out of 10, the additives folks mentioned don't show up because a lot of them are like oil treatments, something that contains elements already in the oil to begin with, so it won't skew the results. But Ben, there's a couple more products I think folks are either familiar with or they might be wondering about themselves. So CamGuard, I think, absolutely with aircraft crowd, right?
Oh, yeah. I would go so far as to say I see more samples that use CamGuard in aircraft engines than I do samples that don't use it.
And obviously, folks are using this to combat corrosion from building up. And CamGuard is going to register as calcium, and you're also going to get some phosphorus from that.
Yeah, primarily calcium and a little bit of phosphorus.
And I think one other one I want to touch on, because I also want folks to remember to note this if they do use it, is Octane Boosters. So why don't you break down for our listeners why that matters and what we might see in the spectral analysis from that?
Sure. And I think I'm going to touch back on Arch Oil along those lines too. But with Octane Boosters, the main reason we always want to know when an octane booster has been used is that octane boosters often contain lead, and that can result in lead being elevated due to harmless blow-by. And the presence of lead in and of itself isn't harmful. A little blow-by, isn't unusual in just about any internal combustion engine. So the presence of lead in and of itself isn't going to harm anything. But the reason we want to know about it is because lead can also come from the bearings, and that can show up as a potential false positive for heavy bearing wear. And especially, with, there are a few engines out there. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but there are a few engines out there that we know of that are known for premature bearing wear. And if we get a sample in with high lead and the person has used an octane booster but hasn't let us know, we could potentially see that and wind up being concerned about premature bearing wear when in reality it's just harmless blow-by from that octane booster.
Yeah, so and I remember you want to reach back to Arch Oil and RevX as well. So are these some additives that we might have some potential issues on the brain if we see these in use, or kind of touch on why it does matter?
A lot like the octane boosters, additives like Arch Oil and RevX. You mentioned that they put a whole bunch of potassium into the oil, and the reason we always want to know when something like those has been used is because potassium is also a potential marker for coolant contamination. Now, generally, Arch Oil, RevX, potassium is going to be really high and typically comes with really high boron. So, if you're an analyst here worth their salt and you see high potassium and boron, we should be able to, at least make a reasonable guess that maybe somebody ran some Arch Oil or RevX, but still, it's always nice to know for certain that potassium is likely coming from that and not coolant. And, another side of that is it can potentially mask coolant in the oil.
So, yeah, I realize so far in this episode, it might seem like, we say most additives don't show up and we're describing all these effects. These are truly the exceptions to the rule.
Along with something like engine restore, the majority of additives don't show up. But we bring these up because they're pretty common additives, and they're the ones that are the most obvious in our testing.
Yeah, the ones we see most often. So if you're not using something like this, chances are good it either doesn't contain elements we test for, or it's going to contain elements already present in the oil to begin with at a similar concentration, so it's just not going to throw off our results. But when you go beyond the spectral analysis, additives can have a couple other impacts we do want folks to keep in mind. If you're using a flush, and if you're using something like Lucas, we might see some impacts in the physical properties. So Ben, if you could just break down Lucas, I would say it's maybe the most common additive that doesn't skew anything in the spectral analysis, but it can have an impact on the oil's physical properties. So let's just break that down for him.
Yeah, and Lucas Oil Stabilizer is one of the most common additives that we see just in general. And again, Lucas is sold as a viscosity stabilizer. And the way it shows up in our testing is not always, but often enough, it will harmlessly thicken the oil's viscosity a bit and make it read above spec for the grade.
And it's nice to know if you did use it because it offers an explanation aside from, excess heat, the oil just not holding up well. So we want to know about it. But again, there's quite a few instances where I tell people, thanks for mentioning Lucas. It didn't have an impact on these results because it's entirely dependent on how much you use. If you add, say, a quart of Lucas to a 4-quart sump, then absolutely it's going to do something as far as the viscosity. But yeah, I mean, it all depends on how much you put in, and sometimes it won't raise the viscosity above the expected range. But it's still, it's worth knowing about, but not necessarily going to, it's never going to keep us from being able to tell how your engine is wearing, and I think that's something I want people to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah, something like that. Even with Lucas, even if it does skew the viscosity a little bit, it's not going to, get in the way of us being able to look at, the wear metals and really the standard oil additives and be able to tell, how things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of along these lines of physical properties, I want to talk a little bit about flushes. So if you add a flush right before you change the oil, then that can kind of mimic fuel dilution. So there's a lot going on here, Ben. So let's see if we can unpack it for him. How do we check for fuel, and why is it that a flush can kind of alter that calculation?
Well, Joe, we test for fuel. I think this might be a refresher because I believe you had an episode on this somewhat recently. Although it could be that I'm hallucinating. I'm not used to the sun, Joe. It's zapping my brain. Anyway, so we test for fuel using the Flashpoint method, where we heat your sample up, and we measure and record the temperature at which its vapors ignite. And the reason we use that method is that fuel contamination lowers the flash point of the oil because gasoline is much more volatile than engine oil is, and so fuel is going to lower that flash point. And depending on how low that flash point is, that will tell us how much fuel is present in that oil. Now, where that's important when it comes to engine flushes, or really any solvent-based product, is that solvent-based products also tend to have a certain amount of volatility to them, and they can also, if there's a little leftover in the case when you fill the fresh oil in there, that can also then lower the oil's flash point, and it can mimic fuel dilution. So, we could get a sample that, based on the flash point, looks like it might have 2-3% fuel dilution in there, when really that's not fuel at all. That's just a little residual engine flush.
And now that we've kind of broken down, all the exceptions to the rule, how these additives do show up, I think the next question on people's mind is, so should I use it? And that's a tough one.
That's the $1 million question right there.
Right. And it's not an easy answer, because I think we can agree that folks notice what I would call sensory benefits. It's something that I can't speak to when I'm looking at the numbers, but they very well could notice a difference in the way the engine runs with Octane Booster, with, Lucas is often used to quiet a noise, which is kind of, it's literally that joke, when my car starts making noise, I turn the radio up louder. It's yeah. Absolutely a Band-Aid measure in most cases. But it's still a real benefit, as far as, folks will mention. I mean, I know literally for years, my dad has used Lucas in his old Toyota, simply because he noticed it wasn't losing as much oil if he added some Lucas. So yes, there are actual, real deal benefits. Like when you talk about flush, it will flush out stuff. Like, you will get sludge removed. But Ben, I think when we're looking at samples and we're trying to tell folks if they're in trouble or not, if their engine or whatever they're sampling is doing well, we care about one area in particular above all else. And why don't we break that down for them as far as what really holds the most importance?
Sure. Yeah. And really what we're interested in is food safety and the prevention of cross-contamination between, say, your meat station and your salad station. No, I'm kidding. We look at engine wear first and foremost.
And when we're looking at a sample, if you've used an additive, we want to see if is it really having a noticeable impact on wear metals, how that engine is wearing.
Right.
If I don't see, Ben, if I don't see an improvement in wear, an obvious difference over how the engine typically gets along, it's really all the same to me whether you used an additive or not. I can't tell you how the engine sounds, I can only tell you how it's getting along mechanically.
Right. And I think it's important to point out, because if there are two questions that I get the most often, one is what type of oil should I be using? And two is, are there any additives that you recommend? And what I usually tell people for that second question regarding additives is that in order to be able to say definitively whether an additive has a noticeable benefit or does not have a noticeable benefit, you would have to have all other variables from one sample to the next absolutely constant. You would need a control group. I mean, it's science. You'd need a control group and you would need an experimental group. And we're just not going to get that in samples from somebody's daily driver or, even somebody's race car, because no matter how much you try to keep things, fairly consistent, you're always going to have some operational changes from one sample to the next. Even minor operational changes are enough to have a little bit of an impact on wear. And because of that, since you have all of these other variables affecting engine wear, it's really hard to say whether or not an oil additive actually has a noticeable, measurable benefit on engine wear.
So to circle back, I would say if there's one absolute rule of thumb here, if you're listening to this show and you've been pondering, using an additive for your engine, I would say there's a good rule of thumb to always circle back to, and that is, do I think my engine has a problem? Because one thing I can tell you, we talk about noticeable benefits or how they show up. I will tell you that never in my years of looking at samples have I seen an additive make a problem go away. So if you think your engine has a problem, I would proceed with sampling and seeing how it looks compared, how's it wearing, is contamination an issue, so on and so forth. And if you find an issue, boy, I think my money's best spent correcting that however I can.
Yeah, and I would personally be very wary of any additive that claims to fix any sort of issue.
Yes. There are some exceptions to the rule. We've covered a lot of them today as far as what shows up and what doesn't. And, there are exceptions where, yes, you might have Lucas help slow a leak or quiet a noise, but the underlying issue, the reason for the oil leaking, the reason for the noise, I don't have any references to look back on where an additive made it go away. So it's never a bad, I'll say this, I've never seen someone make a situation go from bad to worse with an additive in use. I mean,
right.
Like we talked about, 9 times out of 10, they don't show up because, and when I say don't show up, it's not just that they don't contain, elements we test for, what have you. We don't see, wear metals just suddenly spike with additives in use.
Right. Yeah, I have never seen a noticeable difference in engine's wear pattern based solely on the fact that somebody used an additive in one fill and did not use it in another.
So often, I don't know about you, but for me, knowing operation is king when judging wear trends, because so often, wintertime, more idling, increase in iron. I see that all the time. I'm
sure my car has so much extra iron right now. Yeah.
Yep.
Probably some fuel in there too. Baby does a lot of idling these days.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I had, one thing, along these operational, lines of thinking, the first few times I sampled my own car with Blackstone, I routinely had small amounts of fuel. And At first it bothered me, but then I realized that I have a less than 10-minute drive to work.
Mm-hmm. Mine is the same way. As I live less than 10 minutes from the office. I don't do a whole lot of other driving these days. So, most of the miles that are put on my car are very short trips. So, I'm going to have some fuel probably in there. Or I would say I'm not surprised to find some fuel in there just based on that.
Yeah, and so often I think that's where the additive use comes up is a routinely, maybe not a bad result, but a less than ideal result in someone's sample. Mm-hmm. They see something on a reoccurring basis, like maybe some extra wear, maybe contamination. And then I think that's where the additives first come into play, is people are then like, oh, well, I have this result that you are consistently finding and also not describing as great. Let me use an additive to correct it, when in reality, usually a tweak in operation, a change in the way the engine is used would, I think, often have a much more noticeable impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And of course, even though that brings our topic to a close of additives, how they show up, why most of them don't, impacts you may or may not see, it wouldn't be a Ben and Joe episode if we did not talk a little music with y'all. We have to let you know what we're listening to. Ben stopped me before we recorded today and mentioned he had an album for me. And I said, let's save it for the show. Let's talk about it on the program with everybody. So I'm usually in tune with your suggestions, so I'm
Yeah.
excited to see what you have for me. What do we got?
Well, the album I sort of stumbled on, I slept on this. I didn't know when it came out. But this past November, Nick Cave, if you're familiar with Nick Cave, put out a technically a live album. It's called Idiot Prayer, Nick Cave Alone at Alexandra Palace. And it's technically a live album, but there's no audience. And it's just Nick Cave playing alone at a piano, and in a hall somewhere. And Joe, it's hitting me in all the right spots today. I've always liked Nick Cave. But for the longest time, he while I liked him, he was always a little shticky, like Nick Cave, the charming misanthrope, when back when he was doing like albums full of like all murder ballads and all of his stuff, all the things he sang about were like, the dregs of society and all these people doing all these bad things. And then something happened in the last few years where his songwriting really matured. And I don't know if maybe Nick Cave just got really sad. I hope not. Hope you're doing well, Nick. I know you listen to Slick Talk. That's not true. I don't think he listens to Slick Talk at all. Maybe he does, but if you are listening, Mr. Cave, big fan. Hope you're doing well. But he's really matured as a songwriter, and his writing has gotten a lot more earnest. And the thing I really like about this album, Idiot Prayer, is just Nick Cave alone at a piano playing and singing really showcases his talent as a songwriter and a lyricist.
First of all, I'm glad you brought the album up because I know I've scrolled by it, and sometimes you need that suggestion to actually put you onto it. So it's definitely going to get played. But I think like my introduction to him was film scores, because I think he's worked on quite a few, right?
Several, yeah.
And has he done any with Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, or is that just in my head? I think he might have.
I think, well, they may have both written music for the same movie, but to my knowledge, they haven't collaborated. Because the best of my knowledge, the only person Nick Cave really works with on his film scores is Warren Ellis, his guitar player. Mm-hmm. Who you might be thinking about is Mike Patton.
Okay.
Who did work with Trent Reznor on what was that, Place Beyond the Pines, that soundtrack. Oh yeah,
great
great movie and great soundtrack, and I always think of that one as a Nick Cave soundtrack, but it's not. It's a Mike Patton soundtrack with some Trent Reznor in there too.
It's also go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, the film scores that Nick Cave has done that I really like are like The Road, Hell or High Water, The Proposition, which he also wrote the screenplay for. His soundtrack work with Warren Ellis is just amazing stuff.
It's honestly a really perfectly timed album recommendation, just because I just rewatched The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford.
Oh yeah! He did that one too, and he plays the bard at the tavern scene at the end of the movie.
I absolutely love that movie. Yeah, it's just fun. Now it's a movie recommendation too. If y'all haven't watched The Assassination of Jesse James, I'm not going to say the whole title every time. I just gave it its shine that one moment because it is the longest title, and it's also fitting because it's kind of a long movie. But as far as Westerns go, it's definitely one of my favorites. Phenomenal performances in that movie, and a really good Nick Cave score.
Yeah, and a really good Nick Cave score. I really like that movie too. It's much more of a character study than it is, like, don't go into it, expecting the Searchers, but as a character study of both Jesse James and Robert Ford, it's a great film. Great cast too.
Some really, really iconic. I guess the last thing I'll touch on it with, there's a train robbery towards the beginning of the movie.
Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness, the cinematography. If you're into I'm pretty sure Roger Deakins did the cinematography for that too.
I think so.
Oh my gosh, it's if you like that sort of imagery, that iconography, that American, vision of Jesse James standing on a railroad track waiting to hold up a train. I mean, it's pretty good.
Yeah. You could do a lot worse.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ben, it's been fun having you back on. Obviously, folks, when you break down an additive episode like this, we really just want to throw the kitchen sink as far as what, if you're curious about the few exceptions that do impact our tests, but surely there's a lot more that we haven't mentioned that you might be wondering about. So feel free to reach out either on social media. You can give us an email, bstone@blackstone-labs.com. And as always, if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Until next time, this is Blackstone Joe and Ben signing off.
See ya.